To some, on the surface, the world may seem like a very straightforward place. Every sentence has a period, every question has an answer, every action has a reason. But the more time you spend looking into the more colorful aspects of the world we inhabit, the more mysterious aspects, the more you realize that there might be more question marks than periods. And the more you tug on those question marks, sometimes the more questions appear. And while we might think that every situation should have a straightforward answer or conclusion, sometimes that isn't the case. In this video, I'll be going through as many of these little question marks as I can. Strange stories, videos, pictures, and experiences from all over. Some with unsatisfying answers, and some with no answers at all. The following mysteries are true. They are also truly unsettling, baffling, and in some cases, tragic. Each one selected highlighting a distinct fear. The fear of being watched, the fear of losing your child, the fear of an uncaught predator, the fear of the unknown. Elizabeth Barraza, or Liz as she was known by her friends, was living in Tomball, Texas, and was planning her 5-year wedding anniversary. Her and her husband planned on going to Harry Potter World in Orlando. Harry Potter World is a theme park in Florida that's based off the book and movie series of the same name.
In the two uniquely different lands of the wizarding world of Harry Potter.
In order to offset some of the costs that came with the trip, Liz and her husband Sergio decided that they would make up some of the expense by having a big garage sale, where they would try to sell off a number of items from their home that they didn't need anymore. On January 25th, 2019, Sergio left for work at around 6:48 a.m. Liz was already up, and just as Sergio was leaving for work, Liz went outside and began setting up the yard for the garage sale that afternoon. A few minutes later, a dark-colored Nissan Frontier pickup truck pulled up to the home. A person with long hair, or perhaps what appears to be a wig, exits the vehicle. Liz and this individual exchange a few words. And then, suddenly, the visitor pulls out a gun and shoots Liz 4 times, killing her, before getting back into the truck and driving off. A few minutes later, the truck slowly passes past Liz's lifeless body again, presumably to ensure she was dead. Even more harrowing, the entire thing was caught on multiple Ring doorbell camera video feeds. This is a warning. The footage about to be shown is disturbing. Viewer discretion advised. As of the making of this video, there are still no major leads in Liz's case and no motive discovered as to why someone would want her dead, and in such a brutal fashion. Many believe that based on the footage and the circumstances around the shooting, this murder was planned in advance, and the assailant was lying in wait for Liz to emerge from the house. Liz was known as a kind and loving person who would often go to visit children in hospitals dressed up as Star Wars characters on her free time. If you have any information on this case, please contact Houston Crime Stoppers.
All we care about is that the people that did this are caught, successfully prosecuted, and kept from ever doing this to another family.
The city of San Francisco, besides being a city, was also Union Pacific 101, a passenger train which ran between 1936 and 1971. Its route encompassed Chicago, Illinois, and Oakland, California, with ferry service to San Francisco. It was considered a premium service of its time, getting its passengers from Chicago to San Francisco in about 40 hours one way. On August 12, 1939, the City of San Francisco passenger train was headed westbound for Oakland, albeit a little behind schedule. The train engineer was a man by the name of Ed Hecox, who made the decision to slightly increase the speed of the train to make up the time. However, at 9:33 p.m., the train, which was going around 90 miles per hour at the time, hit a patch of rail that had been moved out of alignment with the rest of the track. The misaligned rail was covered by leaves and made it hard to see. The train derailed as it crossed the No. 4 bridge in the Humboldt River Gorge. Ed survived the derailment and crash, and quickly ran to a phone to call emergency services. In total, 24 people died in the incident, and 121 people were injured. Upon further investigation, divers found tools in the Humboldt River a few days later, which told investigators that this was no accident. Someone had sabotaged the tracks on purpose. It was determined that due to the size of the tracks, it would take a very strong person about an hour to dislodge the tracks in the way that they did, if they were to act alone. The trains came about 4 hours apart, giving an individual enough time to complete the sabotage. Initially, police arrested some homeless people and transients for the sabotage of the train tracks, but it was concluded that whoever did this would have had to have some kind of knowledge regarding trains and how railways operate, as well as the skill to use the tools required to pull such a thing off. To this day, there are still no answers as to who committed this deadly sabotage, labeled one of the deadliest train disasters in Nevada. Eerily enough, in 1995 in Palo Verde, Arizona, an Amtrak train was derailed in a similar way, someone sabotaging the rail lines, leading to 2 locomotives derailing, killing 1 and injuring 78. Some have labeled this as some kind of copycat incident. This railroad sabotage has also gone unsolved to this day.
On August 12, 1939, the city of San Francisco, one of the premier passenger trains of its time, was derailed by someone who disconnected a section of track. 24 people died in the accident. The saboteur used the same method to bypass the alarm system. To this day, both wrecks remain unsolved mysteries.
Paperboys were people, usually kids, who in order to make some money part-time would ride around their local neighborhoods and deliver everyone's a newspaper first thing in the morning. This would usually entail the paperboy waking up at dawn, heading down to the printery, collecting a large enough stack of newspapers for their neighborhood, and then riding their bike up and down the streets delivering the paper to each house. 12-year-old Johnny Gosch was one of those paperboys, and on the morning of September 5th, 1982, in Des Moines, Iowa, Johnny was getting ready to do his paper route as he usually did. He woke up at 5:45 a.m., and he and his dog Gretchen took his big red wagon and canvas delivery bag and went to go pick up his stack of newspapers at the street corner where the delivery van would typically leave them for the paper boys to retrieve. Johnny met another paper boy at the spot, and together the two worked to fold the stack of newspapers so they could be delivered more easily. While all of this was happening, a car slowed down, and the driver of the car, who was a stranger to the two boys, briefly stopped and asked them for directions, which they gave, and the cars subsequently drove away. After this, the two parted ways to go complete their respective paper routes, but a few minutes later, the second boy, the one who was assisting Johnny, turned around and saw Johnny talking to a man. But it was still a little dark out, and Johnny was a little ways away at this point, so the boy couldn't tell who it was or if it was the same guy who had asked them directions earlier. But from where the boy was standing, it didn't look like Johnny or his dog Gretchen were in any danger, so he turned around and continued on his paper route. About an hour and a half later, one of the neighbors who was on Johnny's paper route, and who was very used to receiving his newspaper every morning from Johnny, went outside and saw that there was no newspaper there. Concerned, he called Johnny's house, letting them know that Johnny had never shown up to deliver his paper. Immediately, Johnny's father, John Sr., left the house to go look for his son. He found Gretchen, who had made her way back to the family's house alone, and he also found Johnny's little red wagon abandoned on one of the street corners along his paper route. At 8:30 a.m., Johnny's parents called the police. Now, since this was 1982, many law enforcement agencies across the United States adhered to a mandatory waiting period of 48 to 72 hours to file a missing persons report, despite the age of the individual presumed missing. Just as a little aside, despite popular belief, this mandatory waiting period no longer exists, and police departments are obligated to investigate reports of missing individuals without any mandatory period of waiting. But since this was the early 80s, Johnny's parents had to wait 2 days before an official police report could be filed. The police department did dispatch some officers on the day of Johnny's disappearance to help search the neighborhood for the missing boy. But the department did not want to involve the FBI since, as they phrased it, there was no indication that Johnny's life was necessarily in any immediate danger. After a while, the case went cold. Following the disappearance of their son, Johnny's parents would help to establish the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and lobbied for the Johnny Gosh Bill in Iowa, which mandated immediate police response and involvement when a child was reported missing. This bill was later adopted by 8 additional states. However, shortly after the bill was signed into official law, Des Moines, Iowa would face another mysterious tragedy.
Missing Eugene Martin, now age 15, last seen Des Moines, Iowa, August 12, 1984. Call 800-843-5678.
On the morning of August 12, 1984, another paper boy by the name of Eugene Martin, who lived on the south side of Des Moines, left his house to complete his paper route. Just like Johnny, he picked up his stack of papers at a nearby street corner at around 5:15 a.m. and began folding them. Shortly after this, he was seen by multiple witnesses having a friendly conversation with an unknown man as he put his folded newspapers into his delivery bag. And just like Johnny, less than an hour later, one of Eugene's neighbors would call his home saying they never got their paper delivered that morning, and Eugene's parents would go through the same nightmare that Johnny's parents did 2 years earlier. And despite a more rapid response from law enforcement in Eugene's disappearance, the case still quickly went cold and leads quickly dried up. But the efforts to find both Eugene and Johnny wouldn't stop there, and would result in an eerie method of locating missing children that many are still familiar with to this day. A few weeks after Eugene's disappearance, a local grocery store began printing pictures of Eugene and Johnny on their grocery bags. Following their lead, a local dairy company began printing the pictures and a small description of the two boys on the side of their half-gallon milk cartons. Week after week, multiple dairy companies followed suit until it spread from Iowa to Illinois to California, and a few years later in 1985, the nationwide Missing Children Milk Carton program began, featuring hundreds of missing children's pictures on milk cartons. This was the beginning of the infamous Milk Carton Kids.
My belief is based on what I've learned through the information we got that we could verify, and that was that he was kidnapped off the street while doing his paper route, and he was put into what they now call human trafficking.
Cape Elizabeth is a small, quiet beach town in Maine, known for its infamous lighthouse, the Portland Headlight. Cape Elizabeth is not known for crime, and it's known for being rather quiet and chill. But in the early 2000s, quiet and chill would not be how residents of Cape Elizabeth would describe the feeling around town. Around 2005, the police department began getting multiple calls from residents in Cape Elizabeth, and all of them had a very similar, very eerie story. They would say that they would go to bed, fall asleep, and then, in the middle of the night, they would wake up, and there would be a strange man in their home, standing over their bed, staring at them as they slept. As soon as the man would realize they were awake, he would take off running out of the house and into the night. Again, this was not just one person who contacted police with this story. This was multiple people, all who reported the same thing. A strange man staring at them in their room in the middle of the night. The police began investigating the claims of this intruder, speaking with and interviewing those who were willing to come forward and tell their story about this strange man. All of the people said pretty much the same thing. They woke up in the middle of the night and either saw this man staring at them, which would trigger him to immediately flee, or they would catch a glimpse of him as he was making his way out of their room or their home. In all the reported cases, nothing was stolen or damaged in any of the houses, and no one was injured. As police began compiling these stories from people who had these shared experiences, they also at the same time were able to get enough of a description to create a composite sketch of this individual based off the people who actually saw him. Keeping in mind that whenever this Cape Intruder would appear, it would typically be dark and difficult to see, this composite sketch didn't do much as far as actually capturing this individual. Although, as you look at it, it does have an eerie, uncanny valley type feeling to it. Just as quickly as people reported seeing the Cape Intruder, reports of him also vanished just as fast, and he was not seen ever again. He was never caught, and to this day, no one knows who the Cape Intruder really was. Christine enjoyed her life in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and she also loved her dog Ruka, who is a Shar-Pei mix. These two things went hand in hand since the area where she lived in western Albuquerque had plenty of space and vacant lots for Ruka to run around and play in, which is exactly what they were doing on February 2nd, 2009. Christine took Ruka to a vacant lot near her home to play. Just like she had so many times before, Christine let Ruka off his leash and let him run around free for a while. And Ruka, like any other dog would, found something interesting and brought it back to Christine. Ruka had found a bone. Christine looked at the bone and examined it and thought to herself, well, this bone kind of looks like a human bone. But what are the chances that there's a human bone in this random lot and my dog happened to be the one to find it? So she was going to dismiss it, but something in her head pushed her to take that one step further and really verify. And since Christine's sister was a nurse, it wouldn't be that hard to get an answer fairly quickly. So Christine takes out her phone, takes a picture of the mysterious bone and texts it to her sister and says, "Hey, do you know what kind of bone this is? Ruka just found this in an abandoned dirt lot." And right away, Christine's sister tells her, "Yes, that is a human femur bone." And right away, Christine calls the police. Police came out to check the spot where Christine and Ruka had found the bone. And as they were investigating, they made a terrifying discovery. That femur bone wasn't the only bone that was buried out there in what would be known as West Mesa. There were more bones. A lot more bones, coming from multiple bodies. In total, investigators found bones matching 11 bodies. 11 bodies, 11 murders, 11 victims. 2 teenagers and 9 adults, all totally unknown until that one femur bone was found. Quickly, investigators began trying to match the bones with IDs, using whatever forensic analysis they could, and also corroborating the IDs with any missing persons reports that have been filed. And slowly but surely, they were able to identify who those 11 victims were. They were all women, almost all of them were Hispanic, and a number of them were sex workers or victims of sex trafficking. One of the victims, a 15-year-old girl named Jamie, was found buried next to her cousin, who was 27 years old, named Evelyn. Both had vanished and had been reported missing after walking to a park in 2004. Another victim, Gina, who was 22, was 4 months pregnant when she was killed. Besides the identification of the victims, the police and FBI had very little to go on. They knocked on doors, got what information they could from family members of the victims and locals, and tried to create a profile of the potential suspect. But surprisingly, there was very little push for the investigation to continue. There wasn't a public outcry to find the serial killer responsible. There weren't a whole lot of resources put onto the investigation, and by 2016, only one investigator remained on the case full-time, a detective named Mark Murray, who created very extensive timelines for each victim. Through the years, there had been some fairly strong suspects for the West Mesa murders, the most notable of which was a man named Lorenzo Montoya, who had a history of assault against sex workers. In 2006, Lorenzo met up with a dancer from a nearby club and actually ended up strangling her to death and wrapping her body up in a tarp in the middle of the night, and it appeared as if he was going to bury her. But her boyfriend found her location, and when he arrived and saw what happened and what Lorenzo had done, he pulled out a gun and shot Lorenzo to death right there on the spot. So even though he was a strong suspect for the murders and fit the profile, nothing concrete could be established. There is one piece of evidence from the West Mesa murders that still sits as one of the most chilling. When this massive gravesite was being unearthed, investigators looked up the location on satellite. The satellite image they got was taken in 2004, 6 years prior to the bones being found. The satellite image showed the area of the burial site, with a set of tire tracks leading right to the spot where the bones would eventually be found. Those tire tracks, no doubt, belonging to the West Mesa murderer. Today, there is very little work done to actively solve the case, and the identity of the killer remains a mystery. A professor at the University of New Mexico named Dirk Gibson, who had been particularly disappointed with how the police and FBI handled this whole investigation, said the following: "Albuquerqueans don't relate to the victims. They think they're just a bunch of hookers and drug addicts. Police budgets are stretched thin. There's so little money and there are so many crimes. Investigating a 10-year-old crime where the police think the victim had it coming, there's just no incentive for that." And now, here's a little bonus one for you guys. Morgan Robertson grew up near the Great Lakes in 1861, and for a large part of his life, seafaring played a major part in his time growing up. Morgan's father, Andrew, was a ship captain on the Great Lakes, and Morgan himself went to sea at age 15 and was a cabin boy in the merchant service. Throughout his time in the merchant service, he would grow more and more accustomed to being out on the water, and he would gain more and more experience until 1899, he was promoted to first mate, which was a pretty big deal. The first mate was the chief officer, and was typically the head of the deck crew and managed the ship's cargo. Eventually, though, Morgan would get tired of his life at sea, and he left the mariner's life to go study jewelry making. He enjoyed this and worked for 10 years as a diamond setter, before realizing that this work of staring at tiny diamonds and precisely positioning them under a jeweler's scope for hours a day was really taking a toll on his vision. It was then that he decided he would become an author, and the stories he would write, although they were fiction, would have an extra sense of authenticity to them because of Morgan's background. He mainly wrote stories about the sea and ships and submarines, a topic he was more than qualified to write about because of all the years he spent at sea in his youth. Now, Morgan didn't become super famous writing his stories. He mainly sold them to magazines and smaller publications, but he was able to support himself. One short story he wrote, however, did garner much more attention than the rest for a very eerie reason. In 1898, Morgan wrote the short fiction novel entitled Futility or the Wreck of the Titan. In his story, he described a massive British passenger liner called the SS Titan. This ship, triple screw, 800 feet long, and was so large and so massive it was deemed to be unsinkable, and as a result, didn't carry nearly enough lifeboats as would be required for a ship that size. In Morgan's fictional story, he describes how the Titan sets out on a long voyage in April, carrying many passengers. When the Titan reaches the North Atlantic, though, about 400 miles south of Newfoundland, traveling at 25 knots, it hits an iceberg on the starboard side and sinks, killing half of the 2,500 passengers on board. Now, if this sounds familiar to you, it's because 14 years after Morgan Robertson wrote the fictional short story Wreck of the Titan, the practically unsinkable real ship, the RMS Titanic, which was a triple-screw 882-foot-long liner which didn't have enough lifeboats, set out on a voyage in April. When the Titanic reached the North Atlantic, 400 miles south of Newfoundland, traveling at 22.5 knots, it hit an iceberg on the starboard side and sunk, killing over half of the 2,220 people on board. An eerie coincidence.